It was a cold Monday morning on the New York City subway, one of those mornings where the air bites at your skin and everyone's in a rush to escape it. Jam-packed with tired commuters, the train screeched to a halt at 14th Street Station, its passengers exhaling as doors hissed open. Among the shuffling feet and murmurs, Arthur Johnson, a 68-year-old black man, stepped into the train. Arthur had been on this routine for years. A retired history teacher, he still volunteered at a community center where he helped kids after school. He was dressed neatly, pressed trousers, a wool coat that had seen better days, and a hat perched carefully on his head. A plastic bag dangled from his hand, inside of which sat a thermos of coffee and a book about the Harlem Renaissance, a period he often spoke about with pride. As Arthur entered, the younger passengers barely noticed him, busy with earbuds and glowing phone screens. But someone else did. Officer Bradley Shore stood near the end of the car, his stiff uniform crisp as always. Shore was a security guard contracted to patrol the subway lines. He was young, maybe 30, and broad-shouldered, with piercing blue eyes that scanned the crowd like a predator hunting for prey. Shore had always been by the book, a man who claimed he didn't see race, but whose actions often suggested otherwise. Arthur found a seat next to a college student who didn't even look up. He sighed with relief, setting his bag carefully by his feet. As the train pulled out of the station, Arthur lost himself in his book. But then, a sharp voice broke through the rhythmic clatter of the train wheels. "Hey, you!" Arthur glanced up, startled, as Officer Shore approached, his hand already resting on the baton strapped to his belt. The passengers nearest to Arthur began shifting uncomfortably. "What seems to be the problem, officer?" Arthur asked calmly, his deep voice steady and dignified. "You think I'm stupid? Show me what's in the bag." Arthur blinked. "Excuse me?" "The bag. Now." Shore's tone was low and sharp, drawing attention from people further down the car. "I've seen men like you trying to smuggle stuff in these trains before. Drugs, alcohol, weapons. What's in it?" Arthur's jaw tightened. "It's just my lunch, officer, a thermos of coffee and a book," Shore sneered. "Yeah? Let's see it." Arthur hesitated. His pride warred with the instinct to comply, but passengers were staring now, their eyes flicking between him and Shore. Slowly, Arthur leaned down, his arthritic fingers trembling slightly as he picked up the bag and opened it. Out came the thermos, the book, nothing else. Shore snatched the items. He unscrewed the thermos, spilling coffee onto the floor of the subway car. The rich smell wafted through the air as the liquid pooled by Arthur's shoes. Was that really necessary? Arthur's voice trembled, but not with fear, with restrained anger. "Sit down and shut up," Shore growled, tossing the empty thermos back into the bag. For a long moment, no one moved. The train had gone quiet. A child clutched their mother's hand. A woman with glasses pulled out her phone, recording the incident as discreetly as she could. "Why are you doing this?" Arthur finally asked, his gaze steady and unyielding. "Because I can." Shore's response was flat, almost smug. And then something broke. A man, young, white, wearing a suit, stood up suddenly. "That's enough. He didn't do anything wrong." Others murmured in agreement. "Leave him alone," someone else said. Shore turned, his authority suddenly wavering. "Sit down, sir. This doesn't concern you." "No," the man shot back. "It does. I've seen you do this before." The tension escalated like a taut wire about to snap. Shore's face turned red, his hand twitching toward his baton. Arthur slowly rose to his feet. "Son," he said softly to the young man who'd stood up, "it's all right." But it wasn't all right, and everyone knew it. The air buzzed with unspoken words, fear, anger, frustration. When the train reached the next station, the doors opened, and two NYPD officers happened to be waiting on the platform. Seeing the scene inside, they boarded immediately. "What's going on here?" one of them asked, stepping between Arthur and Shore. The woman with glasses spoke up. This guard just harassed that man for no reason. I got it on video. Shore stiffened, his confidence shattering. Arthur, meanwhile, said nothing. He simply looked at the officers with quiet dignity. The officer with the badge looked at Shore. "Is this true?" Shore stammered, his bravado gone. I thought he looked suspicious. I was just doing my job." The NYPD officer's expression hardened. "That's not your job. Step off the train, Officer Shore." Shore sputtered a protest, but the officer didn't budge. Finally, with muttered curses under his breath, Shore stepped off, leaving the train car in stunned silence. The doors closed behind him, and the train began moving again. Arthur sat back down, his movements slow and deliberate. The young man in the suit leaned over. "I'm sorry that happened to you, sir." Arthur smiled faintly. "It's not your fault." The woman with the phone spoke up, her voice shaking. "I'll send this to the transit authorities. They need to know." Arthur nodded his thanks, though his gaze drifted back to his bag, his ruined thermos and coffee. The train continued into the darkness of the tunnel, but something had changed. The people around Arthur seemed different now, like a silent agreement had been made. They wouldn't look away next time. Arthur looked down at the book in his lap and turned a page, his fingers steady once more. The world was still broken, he thought, but maybe there was hope in the cracks. The morning after the incident, Arthur Johnson sat at his kitchen table, the sun filtering through the lace curtains that his late wife had once adored. The room was quiet, except for the faint hum of the refrigerator and the occasional groan of the old pipes in his building. Arthur's mind, however, was anything but calm. He stirred a cup of coffee absent-mindedly, a fresh thermos sitting beside him, a gift from his neighbor, Mrs. Morales, who had heard about what happened. News travels fast, Arthur thought. The video of the subway incident had gone viral overnight. His image, an elderly black man in his Sunday-best coat, being humiliated by a power-drunk security guard, was now plastered across social media platforms. News anchors debated the incident on morning shows. Some voices praised the passengers for standing up. Others pointed to the deeper, systemic problems the video represented. Arthur hadn't watched the clip himself. He didn't need to. He'd lived it. Meanwhile, across town, Officer Bradley Shore sat in a small conference room at his company's headquarters. The walls were bare, and the silence felt suffocating. His supervisor, a stern woman named Denise Calloway, glared at him from across the table. "You're suspended, Bradley," she said finally, her voice sharp. "Indefinitely. Pending an internal investigation." Bradley's jaw clenched. "It was a misunderstanding," he grunted. "I was doing my job." Denise narrowed her eyes. "Your job doesn't include targeting innocent people because of the way they look. Do you know how much trouble you've caused? The city's breathing down our necks. The public wants your head on a plate." Bradley said nothing. In truth, he wasn't sure what to say. Somewhere in the back of his mind, there was an inkling of guilt, an uncomfortable whisper that he'd crossed a line. But he pushed it down. It wasn't that big of a deal, he told himself. "I'm done explaining myself," he muttered. Denise's lips curled in distaste. "You'll have plenty of time to think about it, Bradley. For now, get out of my office." Bradley left, slamming the door behind him. Back in Harlem, Arthur walked down the street toward the community center where he volunteered. The weight of what had happened on the subway was heavier today. Strangers on the street nodded at him in quiet acknowledgement. Some even stopped to shake his hand. "Thank you for what you did, sir," one man said. Arthur frowned. "I didn't do anything." "You kept your dignity. That's something." The words stayed with Arthur as he arrived at the center, where kids were already bustling around, their laughter echoing in the halls. It was a safe place, a haven for the young souls who lived in a neighborhood that didn't always offer second chances. "Mr. Johnson," a boy called out, running up to him. "I saw you on TV. You're famous." Arthur chuckled softly, though he didn't feel famous. He felt tired. The community center's director, Tasha Wells, approached with concern in her eyes. "Arthur, you okay? I heard about what happened." Arthur sighed. "I'm fine, Tasha. Really, just another day." "Doesn't sound like just another day to me. You didn't deserve that." "Maybe not," Arthur replied, looking out the window at the bustling street. "But life has a way of testing us." Tasha studied him for a moment before nodding. "Well, you're stronger than most, Arthur. Those kids need you here." Arthur gave her a small smile. "They keep me going." That evening, Bradley sat alone in his apartment. The TV was on, though he wasn't paying attention. News segments continued to replay the video of the incident. The more he heard the commentators speak, words like racist, abuse of power, and discrimination, the angrier he became. "They don't know me," he spat at the screen. "They don't know what I've been through." Bradley had grown up in a rough neighborhood himself, poor, overlooked, and angry at the world. Joining the subway security team had felt like a chance to gain control, to make something of himself. But now he was just another headline, another bad guy. His phone buzzed with a text from a coworker. "They're dragging you online, man. You might want to lay low." Bradley threw the phone onto the couch. For the first time in years, he felt small, powerless, and he hated it. Over the next few days, the video continued to spread. News outlets picked up the story, and the public outcry grew louder. Protests started popping up near the subway stations, with people holding signs that read, "Justice for Arthur Johnson," and "Stop the Abuse." Arthur, meanwhile, tried to go about his life quietly. He didn't want attention. He didn't want protests. He just wanted things to settle down. But one afternoon, as he walked home from the center, he saw something unexpected. A figure standing on the corner near his apartment building. It was Bradley Shore. Arthur froze. For a moment, the two men just stared at each other. Bradley's shoulders were slumped, his usual air of arrogance nowhere to be seen. He looked lost. Finally, Arthur stepped forward, his voice calm but firm. "What are you doing here?" Bradley cleared his throat, looking at the ground. I wanted to talk to you." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "Talk? About what?" Bradley shoved his hands into his pockets, his gaze still averted. "About what happened. About what I did." Arthur studied the young man carefully, searching for any hint of insincerity. "You've got something to say. Say it." Bradley exhaled slowly, finally meeting Arthur's eyes. "I was wrong." The admission hung in the air like a weight. "I don't know why I did it," Bradley continued, his voice quiet. "Maybe it's the way I was raised. Maybe it's just me being, I don't know, stupid. But I was wrong to treat you like that." Arthur said nothing, letting Bradley's words settle. He wasn't sure what surprised him more, the fact that Bradley was here or the fact that he seemed genuine. "I've been suspended," Bradley added. "Might lose my job. But maybe I deserve it." Arthur studied him for a long moment before speaking. "Why are you really here, son?" Bradley's voice cracked. "Because I don't want to be that guy anymore, the one on the news, the one people hate." Arthur's expression softened slightly. He could see the pain behind Bradley's words, the shame, the confusion, the fear of losing everything. "You've got a lot to learn," Arthur said finally. "But recognizing your mistakes? That's the first step." Bradley nodded, his face pale but determined. "I want to make it right." Arthur didn't respond right away. Instead, he turned and began walking toward his building. Before he stepped inside, he looked back at Bradley. "Meet me here tomorrow," Arthur said. "Same time." Bradley frowned. "For what?" Arthur's lips curved into a small, knowing smile. "You'll see." And with that, he disappeared inside, leaving Bradley standing alone on the corner. The next day, the air was brisk and cold, as Bradley Shore stood awkwardly on the corner near Arthur Johnson's apartment. He was out of uniform, wearing a simple coat and jeans, and the absence of his badge made him feel naked. Every so often, he'd glance over his shoulder, as if expecting someone to recognize him. But the truth was, no one paid him any mind. At exactly noon, Arthur emerged from the building. Dressed in his usual neat attire, Arthur carried a simple leather satchel slung over his shoulder. Without a word, he looked at Bradley and gestured with his head. "Come on." Bradley hesitated. "Where are we going?" Arthur turned, already walking. "You'll see." Bradley had no choice but to follow, trailing behind the older man as they walked through Harlem's busy streets. People bustled past, street vendors calling out, kids running ahead of their parents, and cars honking in the distance. Bradley felt out of place here, like he didn't belong. Arthur, however, walked with purpose and familiarity, offering quiet nods to the people they passed. Eventually, they stopped in front of a weathered brick building, the community center Arthur often spoke about during interviews that had circulated since the subway incident. "What is this?" Bradley asked. Arthur paused at the entrance and turned to him. "This is where you'll start." "Start what?" "Making it right." Bradley blinked. "You want me to volunteer here?" "I want you to understand," Arthur corrected. "You need to see beyond yourself. I can't teach you that sitting at a kitchen table or listening to you apologize. You have to experience it." Bradley shifted uncomfortably. "I didn't sign up for this." Arthur's eyes hardened, his voice firm. "You showed up, didn't you? That counts for something. Now either come inside or walk away. Your choice." For a moment, Bradley considered turning back. Every instinct told him to leave, to escape the discomfort. But Arthur's quiet, unyielding stare seemed to weigh on him. Finally, Bradley let out a sharp breath and muttered, "Fine." Arthur pushed the door open, and they stepped inside. The community center was alive with activity. Kids ran down the hallways laughing, holding basketballs and art supplies. A group of volunteers sorted through boxes of donated clothes in one corner, while others prepped sandwiches for the center's lunch program. The place smelled like old wood and fresh coffee, with a faint hint of paint from a mural being worked on in the gymnasium. Arthur led Bradley to a small office, where a woman sat behind a desk, filling out paperwork. She was in her 40s, with warm brown skin and a no-nonsense demeanor. "Bradley, meet Tasha Wells," Arthur said. "She runs this place." Tasha looked up, her brow furrowing as she took in Bradley's unfamiliar face. "Who's this?" "A new volunteer," Arthur replied calmly. Tasha narrowed her eyes at Bradley. She'd seen the video. Everyone had. And her skepticism was clear. "Is that so?" Bradley cleared his throat, feeling small under her gaze. "I guess." Tasha leaned back in her chair, crossing her arms. "Arthur, can I talk to you for a minute?" Arthur gave Bradley a quick nod. "Wait here." The two stepped into the hallway, where Tasha lowered her voice. "Arthur, are you serious? You brought him here?" Arthur held up a hand. "I know what you're thinking, Tasha, but everyone deserves a chance to do better." "Not everyone," Tasha shot back. "I don't want him near these kids." Arthur's voice was steady, but firm. "He's not here for the kids, he's here for himself. To learn, to fix what's broken." Tasha stared at Arthur for a long moment before sighing. "This is your call, Arthur, but I'm watching him." Arthur nodded. "That's all I ask." Back in the office, Bradley shuffled his feet, feeling out of place. When Arthur returned, he handed Bradley a pair of gloves and pointed to the back hallway. "You'll start in the pantry," Arthur said. "There's food that needs sorting." Bradley frowned. "What does this have to do with—" "Everything," Arthur interrupted. "It has to do with everything." Reluctantly, Bradley followed Arthur to the pantry, a small room stacked to the ceiling with cans, boxes, and crates of donated goods. Arthur handed him a clipboard. "Sort everything by type and expiration date. Let me know when you're done." Bradley stared at him. "That's it?" Arthur shrugged. "For now." Bradley scowled but said nothing. He grabbed a crate and got to work, feeling the weight of the task settle in. For the next 2 hours, he moved silently through the pantry, sorting cans of soup, boxes of pasta, and bags of rice. The work was monotonous, but it gave him time to think. "Why am I even here?" he wondered. His thoughts wandered back to the subway incident, to Arthur's steady, unshaken gaze. For the first time, Bradley thought about how Arthur must have felt: humiliated, disrespected, powerless, and an unfamiliar pang of guilt tightened in his chest. When he finished, he found Arthur in the gym, sitting on the bleachers while a group of kids played basketball. "I'm done," Bradley muttered. Arthur looked up. "Good. Come sit." Bradley hesitated, but finally sank down beside him. Together, they watched the kids play, laughing, shouting, carefree. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Arthur broke the silence. "What do you see?" Bradley frowned. "Kids playing basketball." Arthur shook his head. "Look closer. What do you see?" Bradley glanced at the court again. This time, he noticed the details: the worn shoes, the frayed laces, the mismatched jerseys. He noticed how one kid passed the ball to another, encouraging him after he missed a shot. "They look happy," Bradley said slowly. "But some of them, they don't have much, do they?" "No, they don't," Arthur replied. "But they have each other, and they have this place." Bradley swallowed, feeling an unfamiliar heaviness in his chest. "You see, Bradley," Arthur continued, his voice soft, "it's not about what you take. It's about what you give." Bradley didn't respond, but Arthur could see that the words had hit their mark. The young man's shoulders were slumped, his expression conflicted. After a moment, Arthur stood. "Same time tomorrow. Don't be late." Bradley looked up, startled. "You want me to come back?" Arthur smiled faintly. "You've got a long way to go, son, but it's a start." Bradley watched as Arthur walked away, his footsteps echoing in the empty gymnasium. For the first time in years, Bradley felt something shift inside him, a crack in the walls he'd built around himself. Maybe this is where things change, he thought. Bradley Shore showed up the next day. He wasn't sure why. Something about Arthur's quiet persistence and those words, "It's not about what you take, it's about what you give," stuck with him. He didn't sleep well the night before. Every time he closed his eyes, flashes of the subway incident haunted him: the look on Arthur's face, the judgmental stares of the passengers, and the endless echo of his own cruel voice. "Because I can." It gnawed at him. When Bradley arrived at the community center, Arthur was waiting at the front entrance, leaning on his cane. "You're on time," Arthur said with a slight nod. "Good start." Bradley shoved his hands in his pockets. "What's the plan for today?" Arthur gestured toward the gymnasium doors. "You'll find out." As they stepped inside, the gym was already alive with noise. Children dribbled basketballs, laughter bouncing off the walls, while volunteers set up tables for an arts and crafts session on the other side of the room. Bradley's gaze drifted over the mismatched tables, the kids' scuffed shoes, and the faded paint on the walls. The place had seen better days, but it was alive with energy. "Today you're helping James," Arthur said, pointing to a wiry teenager sitting cross-legged on the gym floor, sketching in a notebook. "He's working on a mural for the back wall." Bradley raised an eyebrow. "A mural?" Arthur smiled faintly. "You're not just sorting cans today, son. It's time you got your hands a little dirty." James barely looked up as Bradley approached, a bag of paints and brushes slung over his shoulder. The boy couldn't have been more than 15, his hair a bundle of tight curls, and his face pinched in concentration. Arthur said I'm supposed to help you," Bradley muttered. James glanced at him skeptically. "You know anything about painting?" "Not really." "Figures." Bradley felt his jaw tighten. "Look, kid, I'm just here to help. What do you need me to do?" James sighed, handing him a large paint roller. "You can prime the wall. Don't mess it up." Bradley nodded, grateful for the simple task. For the next hour, he worked quietly, rolling thick white paint onto the back wall of the gym, creating a blank canvas for whatever James had in mind. Occasionally, he'd glance over at the boy who sat nearby, lost in his sketches. "What's it gonna be?" Bradley asked finally. James didn't look up. "It's gonna tell a story." Bradley frowned. "What kind of story?" James paused, his pencil hovering over the page. "A story about this place? About us. You wouldn't get it." Bradley didn't respond. Instead, he kept painting, the boy's words lingering in his mind. About us. There was something in James's voice, something heavy and unspoken. For the first time, Bradley wondered what the kid's life was like outside the walls of the center. Doi Dios Sawbog at lunchtime, Bradley sat on the bleachers, watching the kids swarm around tables where volunteers handed out sandwiches and fruit. He hadn't been around this many kids since, well, ever. He watched as James sat with a group of younger boys, showing them his sketches. Arthur approached, sitting beside him with a thermos of coffee, one that hadn't been spilled this time. "You're quiet," Arthur observed. Bradley shrugged. "Just watching." Arthur followed his gaze toward James. "Smart kid. Talented, too. But life hasn't made it easy for him." "What do you mean?" Arthur sighed, staring into his coffee. James's parents both work 2 jobs. He's the oldest of 3, so most of the time, he's the one taking care of his siblings. He comes here after school to escape for a while, to create. Bradley frowned. "He's just a kid." "That's a lot." Arthur nodded. "It is. But he doesn't complain. He just keeps going." Bradley looked back at James, who was laughing now as one of the younger kids smeared peanut butter on his nose. For a moment, something in Bradley's chest twisted, an unfamiliar ache. How had he never noticed before? Kids like James, kids with talent, dreams, and burdens far too heavy for their small shoulders, existed all around him, and he'd never cared. "You still think you know everything, Bradley?" Arthur asked quietly. Bradley shook his head. "No." Arthur smiled faintly. "Good." By the afternoon, the first layer of the mural had begun to take shape. James directed Bradley with surprising authority, pointing out where to fill in base colors and clean up edges. Bradley listened, following the boy's instructions without question. Something about working with his hands, about creating instead of destroying, settled him. When they finally packed up for the day, James stepped back to look at the wall. Though it was far from finished, the outline was clear. The mural depicted a group of children gathered in a circle beneath a sprawling tree, its branches stretching high above them. "It's about hope," James said simply, tucking his notebook under his arm. Bradley glanced at the boy, surprised. "Hope?" James shrugged, avoiding his gaze. "Yeah, that's what this place means to me." Bradley swallowed hard, unsure how to respond. He looked back at the mural, its rough edges and empty spaces waiting to be filled. For some reason, it reminded him of himself. Unfinished, rough around the edges, but maybe capable of being more. "Hey, kid," Bradley said finally. "You're a good artist." James smirked. "Yeah, I know." Bradley couldn't help but chuckle. For the first time in a long time, the sound felt natural. Arthur was waiting by the door when Bradley grabbed his coat. "How'd it go?" the older man asked. Bradley shrugged. "Not bad." Arthur smiled knowingly. You'll be back tomorrow, then? It wasn't a question. Bradley looked at him for a long moment before nodding. Yeah, I'll be back. Arthur's smile widened. Good. As Bradley stepped outside, the cold air hit him, but he barely noticed. He glanced back at the center, hearing the muffled sounds of kids laughing from inside. For the first time in years, he didn't feel empty. He didn't feel lost. Instead, he felt like he'd taken a first step towards something better, something meaningful, and that was enough. The next morning, Bradley Shore stood outside his apartment, staring at his reflection in the dirty glass of the building's front door. He barely recognized the man looking back at him. It wasn't just the stubble that had begun to sprout across his jaw or the tired lines under his eyes. It was something deeper. Something was shifting, though he couldn't quite put a name to it. He adjusted his coat, grabbed his keys, and started walking. The air was sharp, and his breath fogged in the cold. As he moved toward the community center, Bradley felt something gnawing at him. A voice he hadn't heard in years whispered from the back of his mind. "What are you doing, Brad? What are you trying to prove?" For a long time, Bradley had lived in anger. Anger at the world, at people who didn't understand him, at himself. It was easier that way. You don't have to feel guilt if you've convinced yourself everyone else is to blame. But now, the cracks were showing. Arthur and that boy James were forcing him to see things he didn't want to see. When Bradley entered the community center, the hum of activity greeted him like a distant hum of music. He found Arthur right where he expected, in the gym, standing near James and a small group of volunteers who were finishing the early stages of the mural. Arthur noticed Bradley and gave him a small nod. "You're back," Arthur said. "Told you I would be," Bradley replied, trying to sound casual. "Good. James could use some help finishing the details on the tree branches. He's got small hands, but the boy can't be everywhere at once." Bradley's lips quirked into a smirk. "Bossy kid." "Focused," Arthur corrected. "You could learn a thing or two from him." Bradley didn't argue. He made his way toward James, who handed him a fine-tipped brush. "You're on branch duty," the boy said. "Ah, got it," Bradley muttered. As they worked side by side, Bradley found himself studying the mural more closely. The children under the tree were coming to life, their faces etched with expressions of joy and determination. The details James added, small books in their hands, a soccer ball, even a small girl clutching a teddy bear, gave the mural a depth that tugged at something inside Bradley. "Why the tree?" Bradley asked quietly. James glanced up from his sketchbook. "Because trees grow, even in bad soil. My grandma used to say that." Bradley froze for a second, the words hitting him harder than he expected. "Even in bad soil." "That's smart," Bradley murmured. "Yeah," James replied, shrugging. "She's smart. Raised me when my parents couldn't." Bradley looked at him, surprised. "Your grandma raised you?" James shrugged again, his voice steady but tinged with something deeper. "Yeah, my mom and dad tried, but they're busy, working all the time, you know. Grandma taught me about art, though, told me to put my heart into it." Bradley didn't respond. He felt a flicker of recognition in James's words, as if the boy had reached into his past and pulled out a piece of him. He thought about his own childhood, about his father, a bitter man who had spent more time at the bottom of a whiskey bottle than he had with his son. By lunchtime, Bradley stepped away to wash the paint off his hands. He found Arthur in the kitchen, making sandwiches for the kids. The older man glanced over his shoulder. "You're quiet today," Arthur said. Bradley grabbed a paper towel and leaned against the counter. "Just thinking." "About?" Bradley hesitated. "The kid, James. He's been through a lot, huh?" Arthur nodded, spreading peanut butter across a slice of bread with practiced precision. "Most of them have. Life doesn't always play fair." Bradley stared at the floor. "Yeah, I know something about that. Arthur paused, setting the knife down and looking at Bradley carefully. What do you mean? Bradley let out a slow breath, the words catching in his throat. For a moment, he wasn't sure if he could say it, but something about Arthur, the man's calm, unshakable presence, made him feel safe. My dad, Bradley said finally, his voice low. He wasn't a good man, drank too much, got mean when he did. Arthur didn't interrupt. He just listened. When I was a kid, I thought it was normal, Bradley continued, his fingers tightening around the edge of the counter, getting yelled at, pushed around. He used to tell me I'd never amount to anything, that the world didn't care about people like us. Arthur's voice was quiet. And you believed him? Bradley swallowed hard, his throat tight. Yeah, I guess I did. The silence stretched between them for a moment before Arthur spoke. That's a heavy burden to carry, son. Bradley looked up, his voice bitter. Doesn't excuse what I did, though, what I've been like. Arthur shook his head. No, it doesn't. But understanding where it comes from? That's a start. Bradley frowned, his shoulders slumping. I don't even know why I'm telling you this. Arthur smiled faintly. Maybe because you're ready to stop running from it. Bradley didn't answer. He just stood there, feeling raw and exposed, like Arthur had peeled back the layers he'd spent years building up. That afternoon, Bradley found himself back in the gym, helping James clean up the paint supplies. As they packed the brushes away, James suddenly spoke. You know, you're not as bad as you look. Bradley blinked, startled. What? James grinned. I said you're not as bad as you look. At first, I thought you were just some grumpy dude Arthur dragged in here. Bradley snorted. I probably was. James shrugged, shoving the last of the brushes into a container. Well, you're better now. Kinda. Bradley chuckled softly, shaking his head. Thanks, I guess. As James headed out of the gym, Bradley lingered, staring at the unfinished mural. The sprawling tree, the hopeful faces, it all meant something. It was a story of survival, of growth in bad soil. And for the first time in his life, Bradley wondered if maybe, just maybe, he could grow too. Roll. That night, Bradley sat on the edge of his bed in his small apartment, staring at the cracked photo frame on his nightstand. Inside, it was a picture of his father, a man he hadn't spoken to in years. I'm not gonna be like you, Bradley muttered under his breath, his voice barely audible. He lay back on the bed, staring at the ceiling. For years, he'd buried the pain, buried the anger, but now it was bubbling to the surface. It was uncomfortable, even painful. But something about it felt necessary, like a wound finally being cleaned so it could heal. For the first time in years, Bradley Shore felt like he had a purpose. It wasn't much, helping with a mural, sorting pantry goods, sweeping the gym floor, but it was something. He had started to look forward to his days at the community center, even though he'd never admit it. Arthur's quiet wisdom and James's sharp humor chipped away at the walls Bradley had spent years building. The routine was simple, grounding even, and every day Bradley learned something new. The mural was nearly done. Over the past week, the once blank gym wall had transformed into a breathtaking scene. The sprawling tree with deep roots and wide branches now stretched across the center, its leaves vibrant with splashes of green and gold. Beneath it, children from all walks of life were painted in rich, emotional detail, reading books, playing soccer, holding hands. James stood on a stepladder, carefully adding his final touch to the branches. Bradley stood at the base, handing him paints and brushes. You know, Bradley said, squinting up at the boy, this thing's gonna look like it belongs in a museum. James smirked, carefully filling in a leaf. Yeah, maybe one day. Bradley shook his head in amazement. You're gonna go far, kid. Mark my words. The compliment came out naturally, which surprised even him. James glanced down, a flicker of something vulnerable crossing his face, pride mixed with disbelief. "You really think so?" "I know so." For a moment, the two stood in silence, the words settling in. Bradley had never been the kind of man to encourage anyone. His father never encouraged him, and Bradley figured that's just how life was. But here he was, saying something he wished someone had said to him when he was James's age. Arthur watched from across the gym, his sharp eyes taking everything in. He noticed the change in Bradley. It wasn't just in the way he worked, more focused, less resentful. It was in his posture, his tone, the way he looked people in the eye now. He still carried the weight of his past, but it was shifting. Healing, Arthur thought. As Bradley cleaned up paintbrushes, Arthur approached him. "You've come a long way." Bradley looked up, startled. "What?" Arthur smiled knowingly. "I said you've come a long way, from the man I met 2 weeks ago to the one helping these kids." Bradley frowned, uncomfortably rubbing the back of his neck. "I'm just doing what you told me to do." "No," Arthur said, his voice firm but kind. "You're doing more than that. You're choosing to change. That's not easy, son." Bradley paused, his throat tightening. "Does it even matter, though? I mean, does it really erase the bad stuff I've done?" Arthur studied him for a moment before answering. "No one can erase the past, Bradley. But you can decide who you're going to be today. That's what matters. What you do now." Bradley let out a slow breath. "I want to be better, Arthur. I don't know if I can, but I want to." Arthur clapped him gently on the shoulder. "That's enough for now. The rest will follow." That evening, Bradley stayed late to help Arthur clean up the gym. As they worked, Arthur spoke quietly, his voice filled with wisdom born from experience. "Do you know why I keep coming back here, Bradley? To this center? To these kids?" Bradley glanced up. "Because they need you?" Arthur shook his head with a small smile. "Because I need them. I grew up with nothing but anger. My father was a sharecropper who didn't believe in dreams, and my mother worked herself sick trying to feed us. I was angry at the world, at the system, at life itself." Bradley froze, listening closely. He'd never heard Arthur talk about his past before. "I spent years carrying that anger around, letting it poison me," Arthur continued. "It cost me friends, opportunities, even my marriage. But one day, I realized something. Anger doesn't fix a thing. It just keeps you stuck. Stuck in pain, stuck in bitterness." Bradley swallowed hard. "So what did you do?" Arthur met his eyes. "I chose to give my time, my love, my patience to those who needed it. You can't erase what's broken, Bradley, but you can build something new, something better." Bradley stared at the floor, Arthur's words echoing in his mind. "You can't erase what's broken." The next day, Bradley arrived early. The gym was quiet, still empty before the kids showed up. Bradley stood in front of the nearly completed mural, his hands stuffed in his coat pockets. He thought of his father, of all the ways that man had failed him. Bradley had spent his whole life trying not to feel, trying to bury the pain. But the mural, with its towering tree and hopeful faces, made him realize something. He didn't want to live like that anymore. James arrived soon after, a small smile lighting up his face when he saw Bradley. "You're here early." "Yeah," Bradley said, turning to him. "Thought I'd get a head start today." James grinned. "Better late than never, I guess." Bradley chuckled, shaking his head. "You've got a smart mouth, kid." "Yeah, Arthur says it keeps me alive." Bradley laughed again, but there was warmth in his voice, a genuine fondness that hadn't been there before. By the end of the week, the mural was finished. Arthur gathered the kids, volunteers, and even some neighbors to see the unveiling. As the cloth draped over the mural was pulled away, gasps echoed through the gym. The tree was breathtaking, its branches wide and protective, its roots deep and unshakable. Beneath it, the children stood strong, their faces painted with stunning detail and care. There was hope in their eyes, joy in their postures. At the bottom corner of the mural, James had signed his name, but next to it, in small, careful letters, he had painted something else. To Mr. Johnson. And to Mr. Shore. Bradley's throat tightened as he stared at the words. He glanced at James, who stood beside him, his arms crossed, and a proud smirk on his face. "Why'd you put my name on it?" Bradley asked quietly. James shrugged. "Because you helped." Bradley felt his chest tighten, emotions threatening to rise to the surface. He'd never been thanked for anything in his life, and yet here it was, his name, etched into something beautiful, something lasting. Arthur approached, his smile soft and knowing. "I told you, son, it's about what you give." Bradley looked at him, his voice barely a whisper. "I think I get it now." Arthur clapped a hand on his shoulder, the weight of it steady and reassuring. "Good." And that night, as Bradley walked home, he stopped in front of a payphone on the corner of his street. For a long moment, he stood there, staring at it, his hands trembling slightly. Finally, he picked up the receiver and dialed a number he hadn't called in over a decade. The line rang once, twice. Then a voice answered. "Hello?" Bradley swallowed, his voice shaky but determined. "Dad, it's me." The payphone's receiver felt cold in Bradley Shore's hand, but the voice on the other end was unmistakable, rough, gravelly, older now, but still carrying the weight of bitterness Bradley had grown up with. "Brad?" his father said after a long pause. "Is that really you?" Bradley stood frozen, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear. For a second he thought about hanging up, just walking away. But something, Arthur's words, James's mural, the flicker of hope that had begun to spark inside him, kept him grounded. "Yeah," Bradley said finally, his voice low. "It's me. Well, I'll be damned." His father's voice softened just slightly, but not enough to hide the edge of cynicism. "I figured you were dead by now. Didn't think I'd hear from you again." Bradley flinched at the comment, but he let it slide. "I didn't think I'd call." "So what do you want?" It was a simple question, but Bradley didn't have a simple answer. He didn't know what he wanted. Maybe just to hear the man's voice. Maybe to let go of years of anger. Maybe something else entirely. "Nothing," Bradley said after a pause. "I just wanted to see if you were still around." His father let out a dry laugh. "Still here. Same old place. Same old life." The words hung between them, heavy and sharp. Bradley's grip on the phone tightened. "You still drinking?" "None of your damn business," his father shot back, the bitterness returning. Bradley sighed. "Yeah, that's what I thought." "Why'd you call me, Brad?" Bradley hesitated, his mind racing. He thought about James, a kid who still believed in hope, and about Arthur, who carried his wisdom like a shield. He thought about the mural, about growth in bad soil, and for the first time in his life, Bradley found himself speaking from a place of honesty. "Because I don't want to end up like you," he said quietly. The line went silent. For a moment, Bradley thought his father had hung up, but then the older man spoke again, his voice softer now, tinged with something Bradley couldn't quite place. "Well, I guess that's good for you." Bradley blinked, surprised. It wasn't much. It wasn't an apology or an admission of guilt, but coming from his father, it was something. "I don't hate you," Bradley said after a moment. The words tasted strange in his mouth, but once they were out, they felt right. "I did for a long time, but I don't anymore." His father didn't respond. The silence stretched, heavy and unyielding. Finally, Bradley spoke again. "I gotta go," he said, his voice steady now. "Take care of yourself." Before his father could answer, Bradley hung up the phone. He let out a long breath, leaning against the cold metal of the payphone booth. It wasn't closure, not completely, but it was a start. That afternoon, Bradley arrived at the community center with a different energy. He felt lighter, though he didn't fully understand why. Arthur noticed it immediately. "You look like a man who's seen a ghost," Arthur said, leaning on his cane as Bradley entered the gym. "Maybe I have," Bradley replied with a small smirk. Arthur studied him for a moment before nodding. "Good. That means you're facing it." Bradley frowned, glancing at the older man. "How do you always know?" Arthur chuckled. "I've been around long enough to see what happens when a man stops running from himself." Bradley didn't argue. Instead, he joined James, who was touching up the final details on the mural. The boy glanced over. "You're smiling," James said suspiciously. "You hit your head or something?" Bradley snorted. "Maybe I'm just in a good mood." James raised an eyebrow. "Weird." "Yeah," Bradley agreed. "Weird." As the day wore on, Bradley found himself stepping into roles he'd never imagined. He helped the younger kids with their homework, cleaned up supplies, and even laughed when one of the boys managed to dunk a basketball over his head. Arthur watched quietly from the sidelines, a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. In that evening, after the center had closed, Arthur and Bradley sat on the gym bleachers. The place was quiet now, the echo of laughter and bouncing balls replaced by stillness. "You called him, didn't you?" Arthur said suddenly. Bradley looked at him, startled. "How'd you know?" Arthur shrugged. "It's written all over you." Bradley sighed, leaning forward and resting his elbows on his knees. "Yeah, I called him. It didn't go great. But it wasn't as bad as I thought it'd be." Arthur nodded knowingly. "Sometimes that's enough." "I told him I don't hate him anymore," Bradley continued, his voice quieter now. "And I don't. I thought I did. I thought holding on to it would make me stronger. But it didn't." Arthur smiled faintly. "Anger's like carrying a hot coal, son. You think you're hurting someone else, but you're only burning yourself." Bradley nodded, the truth of the words sinking in. For years, he'd been carrying that coal, letting it scorch him from the inside out. But now, it was as if he'd finally set it down. "So what now?" Bradley asked. Arthur clapped a hand on his shoulder. "Now you keep going. You show up, you give, and you build something better." Bradley looked at the mural on the far wall, the tree standing strong and proud, its branches spreading wide. The faces of the children beneath it seemed to glow in the dim light of the gym. For the first time, Bradley felt like he understood what Arthur meant. Life wasn't about erasing the past. It was about growing, even in bad soil. "Thanks, Arthur," Bradley said quietly. Arthur smiled. "Don't thank me yet. There's still work to do." As Bradley walked home that night, he felt the cold air on his face and the steady rhythm of his footsteps on the sidewalk. He thought about his father, about the years of bitterness he'd carried, and about the small, hesitant step he'd taken toward letting it go. He thought about James, a boy with dreams bigger than his circumstances, and about Arthur, a man who had dedicated his life to giving hope to others. And for the first time in a long time, Bradley thought about himself, not as a man defined by his mistakes, but as a man capable of something more. The road ahead wouldn't be easy. Bradley knew that, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid to walk it. It was a week later when Bradley Shore entered the community center and felt something shift, not just in the air, but in himself. The change had been subtle, like the slow spreading of sunlight after a long storm. The bitterness that had been his constant companion was now more of a whisper. It wasn't gone. Bradley wasn't naive enough to believe it ever could be, but he was learning to live beyond it. Arthur's words still echoed in his head. It's about what you give. Bradley had spent so much of his life taking people's dignity, their trust, and most of all, his own chances at happiness. But here, in this place, surrounded by Arthur, James, and the kids who looked at him now with something close to trust, he realized what it meant to give. That afternoon, Arthur had gathered everyone in the gymnasium. A celebration was underway. It was the unveiling of the completed mural for the community, an event that brought kids, volunteers, and even local families who'd heard about the project. The gym had been transformed with chairs and tables set up along the walls, decorated with handmade signs and balloons. The smell of baked goods, casseroles, and hot dishes lingered in the air as parents brought food for a potluck. Laughter and chatter filled the space, a joyful hum of life that Bradley hadn't experienced in years. He stood off to the side at first, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, watching as people trickled in. It felt strange to belong here. Him, of all people. The guy whose face had been on a viral video, condemned by strangers on the internet for his worst moment. The guy who'd been so close to losing himself completely. You waiting for someone to roll out the red carpet or what? Bradley turned to find James standing beside him, a plate of cookies balanced in his hand. The boy grinned at him, his sharp humor as steady as ever. Bradley smirked. You're a real piece of work, you know that? Yeah, Arthur tells me the same thing. James popped a cookie into his mouth and nodded toward the crowd. Come on, people want to see you. Me? Bradley blinked. What for? You helped, didn't you? James said matter-of-factly. That means you're part of this. Before Bradley could argue, James shoved the plate of cookies into his hands and marched toward the center of the gym where Arthur was waiting near the covered mural. Bradley hesitated but followed, his steps slow and uncertain. Show. Arthur tapped the microphone at the front of the gym. The room quieted, all eyes turning toward him. Thank you, everyone, for being here today, Arthur said, his voice carrying the weight of warmth and authority. This mural, this beautiful, hopeful work of art, was made possible because of the kids here, the volunteers, and the spirit of this community. Applause broke out, parents and kids clapping enthusiastically. Arthur held up a hand, quieting the room again. I want to take a moment to recognize someone, he said, his gaze shifting toward Bradley. A man who walked through these doors carrying more than his share of burdens, but chose to stay and face them. Someone who helped bring this mural to life, and who, I believe, is still writing a better story for himself. Arthur's eyes locked with Bradley's. Come on up here, son. Bradley froze. His heart pounded in his chest, and for a split second, the old instinct to flee came roaring back. He didn't belong in front of these people, didn't deserve their applause. And yet, there was Arthur, calm and steady as always, holding out his hand in silent encouragement. Slowly, Bradley stepped forward. The crowd parted for him as he walked toward Arthur, each step heavy but certain. When he reached the front, Arthur clapped a hand on his shoulder and turned toward James. James, Arthur said, would you do the honors? James grinned, stepping forward to pull the cloth from the mural. A collective gasp rippled through the crowd as the finished painting was revealed in all its glory. The sprawling tree, its roots deep, its branches strong, dominated the center of the mural. Beneath it, children of all ages, backgrounds, and colors stood together, their faces painted with expressions of joy, determination, and hope. Small details filled the scene. A little girl holding a paintbrush, a boy holding a book, another holding a soccer ball. And in one corner, Bradley noticed something that made his throat tighten. A figure stood beneath the tree, an older man with glasses and a cane, unmistakably Arthur. Next to him, leaning slightly against the tree trunk, was another man, a younger, uncertain figure, painted with surprising care. Him, Bradley's voice caught. Why'd you put me in it? James, standing beside him, shrugged. Because you're part of it now. Bradley stared at the mural, his chest aching in a way he couldn't explain. Part of it. For so long, he'd seen himself as an outsider, someone who didn't belong, who couldn't be trusted. But here he was, painted into the very thing that symbolized hope. Arthur leaned in, his voice low. It's not about erasing the past, son. It's about what you do with the time you've got left. The celebration carried on well into the evening. Kids ran around with cupcakes, parents chatted, and volunteers shared stories. Bradley found himself pulled into conversations he hadn't expected. Parents thanked him for helping James and the others, while kids waved to him as they passed. For the first time, Bradley didn't feel the urge to escape. Toward the end of the night, as people started to trickle out, Bradley sat beside Arthur on the bleachers, watching James talk excitedly to his grandmother, who had come to see the mural. "Look at him," Arthur said, his voice filled with pride. "That boy's gonna do great things." "Yeah," Bradley agreed quietly. "He will." Arthur looked at Bradley, his sharp eyes softening. "And so will you." Bradley shook his head with a small laugh. "I don't know about that." Arthur smiled. "I do. You've come a long way, Bradley. Don't stop now." Bradley turned to Arthur, the words forming in his chest before he could stop them. "Thank you," he said softly, "for not giving up on me." Arthur's smile widened. "It's never too late for a second chance, son." Bradley looked back at the mural, at the roots and branches that told a story of hope and growth, and something inside him settled. For so long, he had been stuck in the past, weighed down by anger and regret. But now, he realized, he didn't have to stay there. He had work to do. Work on himself, work for others, work to make something better. And for the first time, he was ready. That night, as Bradley walked home through the quiet streets, he found himself stopping once more at the payphone on the corner. He didn't pick up the receiver this time. Instead, he stood there for a moment, staring at the cold metal box. He thought about his father, about the pain that had shaped him, but also about the choices he had now. Choices his father had never made. Bradley took a deep breath, letting the cold air fill his lungs. Then he turned and walked on, his footsteps steady and sure. The mural remained. Over the weeks and months that followed, it became a beacon for the community. People stopped to admire it, to take photos, to talk about its meaning. And every now and then, someone would point to the figure standing quietly beneath the tree, the man with uncertainty in his posture and hope in his eyes. "That's Mr. Shore," the kids would say. "He helped build this." And Bradley Shore, for the first time in his life, would smile, because they were right. He had helped, and that was enough.